The handcuffs were already on my wrists, cold and tight, and my two little kids were standing on the sidewalk watching their father get treated like a criminal. My 8-year-old son, frozen and pale, and my 6-year-old daughter starting to cry. And there was absolutely nothing I could do about it except keep my voice calm and keep telling them it was going to be okay. A police officer had me by the arm. People had stopped to watch, and I was standing there in handcuffs in front of my own children for something I had not done, feeling the worst kind of helplessness a father can feel, when the radio on that officer's shoulder crackled to life, and a voice came through it, loud and hard and urgent, and what it said stopped everything. Release him, now. I'm going to tell you the whole story, who I am, how I ended up in handcuffs in front of my kids, what that voice on the radio knew that changed everything in an instant, and what the officer did next, which is honestly the part that mattered most. But first, I want to tell you the thing this day taught me, the thing I've carried ever since. How a person handles being wrong tells you everything about who they really are. Anyone can be right. It's what you do in the moment you discover you were wrong. That's the true measure of a person. And that day, in front of my children, I watched someone fail that test, and then, remarkably, pass it. Quick word before I get into it, and then I'll let the story go. I'm not a man who likes attention, and this is a hard story for me to tell, so I'll keep this simple. If you've ever been judged for something you didn't do, or ever had to hold yourself together for your kids when everything in you wanted to fall apart, then this story is for you, and I'd be grateful if you stayed to the end. There's a subscribe button down there if it moves you. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of that day, which started as one of the most ordinary days of my life. My name is Eli Barrett. I'm 39 years old, and I'm a single father raising 2 kids on my own. My son, Cody, is 8, and my daughter, Josie, is 6, and they are my entire world. Their mother and I divorced a few years back. It happens, and I won't get into all of it. But the short version is that raising these 2 became my job, full-time, and I have poured everything I am into it. I work hard at a job that doesn't pay much, and I spend every other hour being the best dad I know how to be. It's not a fancy life, but it's a good one, built around those 2 kids, and I'm proud of it. I want to give you a picture of our life, because it matters to what got taken from me that day. When the divorce happened and it became just the 3 of us, I had to become a lot of things at once. I learned to do Josie's hair in the morning, badly at first, better now. I learned which of Cody's moods meant he was actually upset and which just meant he was hungry. I show up to every school thing, every game, every little event, because I decided early that whatever else my kids went without, they were never going to go without a father who was present. Money's tight and the days are long and I'm tired most of the time, but I've built a life where my 2 kids feel completely safe, completely loved, completely certain that their dad has them. That certainty is the whole thing I've built. It's the foundation of their little world. And I mention it now because I need you to understand that when that officer put those cuffs on me, he wasn't just embarrassing a man. He was taking a hammer to the one thing I've worked hardest in my life to build. And there's something else, something specific to men like me. When you don't have much, when you're not wealthy, not powerful, not important in the eyes of the world, your good name is very nearly all you've got. It's the one form of wealth available to a poor man, a clean reputation, the knowledge that you're honest, that you can be trusted, that you've never done wrong by anybody. I've been poor my whole life, but I've always been able to hold my head up because my character was mine and it was spotless. And in those minutes in handcuffs, I felt that one precious possession being stripped away in front of everyone, felt myself being recast as a criminal, and I understood in a way I never had before how much I'd been quietly relying on my good name to feel like a whole person. Take a rich man's reputation and he still has his money. Take a poor man's reputation and you've taken nearly everything. That's why what happened next mattered so much. They didn't just free me, they gave me back the only fortune I own. I tell you this because I need you to understand what it costs a father like me to be humiliated in front of his children. When you're a single dad, when it's just you and them against the world, your kids' faith in you is the foundation of everything. They need to believe their dad is strong and safe and good, that he can protect them, that the world is a place where their father has a respected place. That belief is fragile, and it's precious, and it is the thing I work hardest to protect. And on the day I'm telling you about, I watched a stranger nearly shatter it in about 90 seconds. Here is how it happened. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had the kids with me. We'd just run some errands, nothing special. The small, ordinary business of a dad and his kids on a regular day. We were near our car, in a parking area, Cody chattering about something, Josie holding my hand. Just us, being us. It had been a good afternoon, one of those easy ordinary ones that you don't realize were precious until something shatters them. Cody had been telling me some long involved story about a game he'd been playing, the kind of story that has 40 parts and no ending, and I was doing the dad thing of saying, "Uh-huh, wow, really?" at the right intervals while only half following it. Josie had picked out a small toy she was clutching like treasure. The sun was out. Nobody was crying or fighting. It was, in every way, an unremarkable slice of an ordinary life, the kind of afternoon that makes up the actual substance of raising kids, the small, forgettable good moments that are really the whole point of everything. I had no idea, holding my daughter's hand in that parking lot, that I was about 60 seconds away from the worst moment of my life as a father. You never do. That's the thing about the moments that break you. They almost always arrive dressed as an ordinary Tuesday, and then a police cruiser pulled up, fast, and an officer got out and his whole posture was tense, alert, focused, on me. And before I fully understood what was happening, he was telling me to put my hands where he could see them, his voice hard and urgent, and I was so confused I could barely respond. I remember saying, "Officer, what's going on? I'm here with my kids." And it didn't seem to register at all. He'd locked onto me, and everything about his body language said he'd already decided something about me that wasn't true. I've replayed those seconds 100 times. The way his eyes had that fixed, tunneled quality, already certain. The way my confusion and my attempts to explain seemed to make him more suspicious rather than less, because to a man who's already decided you're guilty, an innocent man's bewilderment can look like guilt too. I felt the situation slipping out of my control in a way I'd never experienced. This horrible sense of a runaway train, where the harder I tried to be reasonable and calm and cooperative, the faster it seemed to move in the wrong direction. And underneath my confusion, a cold fear was rising. Not for myself exactly, but because I could feel Cody and Josie right there beside me, feel them going quiet and scared, and I understood with terrible clarity that whatever was about to happen was going to happen in front of them, and that I was powerless to stop it. There is a specific helplessness in watching a bad thing barrel toward your children when your own reasonable words are bouncing off the person causing it. I'd never known it before that day. I hope I never know it again. What I would only learn later was that there had been a report. A description had gone out over the police radio of a man wanted in connection with something in the area, and that description, in the vaguest possible terms, apparently matched me. Same rough height, same rough build, similar clothing maybe, in the same general area. That's all it takes sometimes. A vague description and a coincidence of geography, and suddenly an innocent man running errands with his kids becomes, in an officer's eyes, a suspect. I understand, now, how it happened. In that moment, I understood nothing except that a police officer was treating me like a dangerous man in front of my terrified children. I tried to explain. I tried to stay calm and tell him who I was, that I was just a dad, that these were my kids, that he had the wrong person. But he wasn't in a listening place. He was in a pressured adrenaline place, working off a report, and he made a decision, the wrong decision, a hasty decision, that he needed to detain me right then, and he put handcuffs on me, in front of Cody and Josie. I need to tell you what that moment did to my children, because it's the part I'll never forget and never fully forgive, even though I've made my peace with the man who caused it. Cody, my brave little 8-year-old, went absolutely white and still, staring at his dad in handcuffs with an expression of pure, uncomprehending fear, his whole world tilting, because the one fixed point in his life, his father, his protector, was suddenly the one being restrained and treated as dangerous. And Josie, my baby, my 6-year-old, just started to cry, this scared, confused wail, reaching for me, not understanding why the police were hurting her daddy, why I wasn't picking her up, why I had my hands behind my back. But it was Cody who broke my heart the most, in a quieter way. Because Cody didn't cry. At 8, he's just old enough to have started absorbing the idea that he should be brave, that he's the big brother, and I watched him try to be exactly that in the middle of his terror. I watched my little boy plant his feet next to his sobbing sister and put a hand on her shoulder, shaking himself, trying to comfort her while his own world was coming apart, because he'd decided in that moment that he had to be strong. 8 years old, watching his father in handcuffs, and choosing to be brave for his little sister. It was one of the proudest and most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. No child should have to find that kind of courage, and the fact that mine did, in that awful moment, told me 2 things at once, that I've raised a good boy, and that this scene was asking something of my children that no child should ever be asked. That's the image that stays with me, not my own humiliation. My son, too young, being too brave, and I want you to understand the specific torture of that moment for me, because every instinct I had as a father, to comfort my crying daughter, to reassure my frightened son, to gather them up and protect them, was completely cut off. My hands were literally bound. I could not hold them. I could not wipe Josie's tears. All I had was my voice, and so I used it, as steady and warm as I could make it, even with my own heart breaking and my own fear rising. I kept saying, "It's okay, guys. Daddy's okay. This is just a misunderstanding. Everything's going to be fine. I need you to be brave for me, okay? Look at me. It's going to be okay." I poured every ounce of calm I could fake into those words, because in that moment, the most important job in my life was not my own dignity, not my own fear. It was making sure my children didn't carry the trauma of that scene for the rest of their lives. I would swallow any humiliation to keep them from being broken by it. I want to be honest about how hard that was, because I think it's the truest thing about being a parent. Everything in me wanted to react the way any wrongly accused person wants to react, to argue louder, to protest, to let my anger and my fear and my wounded pride come pouring out. I had every right to, but I couldn't, because I understood that my children were reading me for how to feel. Kids in a frightening situation look to their parents' face to learn whether they should be terrified or whether it's going to be okay. If I panicked, they would be shattered. If I raged, they would be more frightened. So I had to do the hardest performance of my life. I had to stand there in handcuffs, humiliated, frightened, furious, and radiate calm for them. I had to be a still, steady island in the middle of my own worst moment, purely so that my kids would have something safe to hold on to. I have never worked so hard to control myself in my life. Every muscle in me wanted to break, and I held it together, breath by breath, because my children needed their father to be okay more than I needed to fall apart. That, I think, is the whole job of being a parent, distilled into 90 seconds, being strong for them precisely when you have the least strength to give. But inside, I was in agony, standing there in cuffs, being looked at by gathering onlookers as some kind of criminal, unable to hold my crying kids, feeling my son's faith in me, in the safety of his world, cracking right in front of my eyes. It was, without question, the worst moment of my life as a father. And the onlookers made it worse in a way I hadn't expected. A small crowd had gathered, the way it does, people slowing down, some of them watching, a couple of them with that look people get, the automatic assumption that if the police have a man in handcuffs, he must have done something. I could feel their eyes deciding about me, filing me under criminal, and I remember the hot shame of it, the awareness that to every stranger in that parking lot I was now a guilty man, a bad person, maybe even a danger to the very children standing next to me. Nobody knew I was a devoted single dad who'd never so much as had a parking ticket. They just saw the cuffs and drew the obvious conclusion, and I had to stand there and wear that public verdict, guilty until proven innocent in the court of a random crowd's glance, while I was actually one of the most law-abiding, boring, devoted fathers any of them would ever meet. It's a strange, sickening thing, to feel a crowd of strangers convict you of being a bad person while you're standing there being a good one. I have never felt so helpless. I have never felt so small. And the officer was already moving to the next steps, radioing in, and I felt the whole machinery of a terrible mistake grinding forward, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And that is when the radio crackled. I heard it come through. A different voice, an older voice, a voice with authority in it. And whatever it said in the first burst made the officer holding me go still. And then it came again, clear enough that I heard it, and clear enough that the small crowd heard it. 3 words that cut through everything. Release him. Now. There was a pause. The officer keyed his radio and said something back, a question, and the voice returned, and this time there was no mistaking the force in it. The situation had changed completely. I felt the whole atmosphere shift in an instant, the way the air changes before you consciously understand why. The officer's grip on my arm loosened. His shoulders, which had been squared and tense, dropped. The certainty that had been radiating off him flickered and died, replaced by something else. Something that looked, even in that first second, like the beginning of horror at what he'd done. He keyed his radio again, and I heard him confirm something. Heard him say my general location, heard the crackle of the reply. And I stood very still, my hands still bound, not daring to believe that whatever was happening in my favor, because a lifetime tells a man in handcuffs not to hope. But the pieces were falling into place fast, up in that unseen network of voices, and they were falling in the shape of the truth. Somewhere out there, the actual man they wanted had just been found. And somewhere on the other end of that radio, a senior officer had heard the details and understood, with a jolt, that one of his people had the wrong man cuffed in a parking lot in front of 2 little kids. What I would piece together shortly was this. 2 things had happened at almost the same moment. First, the actual person they were looking for, the real one, the one the description was meant to identify, had just been located and detained elsewhere, which meant definitively that it was not me, that I was exactly who I'd been telling them I was. And second, the senior officer, the sergeant whose voice was on that radio, had heard enough of the situation to understand that one of his officers had detained the wrong man, an innocent father, with his kids in public, and he was not going to let that stand for 1 more second. Hence, release him now. And I felt the cuffs come off my wrists, and the very first thing I did, before anything else, before I even fully registered that it was over, was drop down and pull both my kids into my arms. That was all my body wanted, all it had been screaming for during every second of those cuffs, to hold my children. I gathered Cody and Josie against me and held them tight, and I felt Josie's little arms lock around my neck, and I felt Cody, my too brave boy, finally let go of the composure he'd been holding and shake a little against my chest, and I whispered to them that it was over, that Daddy was fine, that everything was okay now, and this time I wasn't faking the calm, because it was true. I will never take for granted, as long as I live, the simple ability to hold my own children when they're frightened. For a few minutes that afternoon, that most basic right of a parent had been taken from me, and getting it back, feeling their weight against me, being able to comfort them at last, was the sweetest relief I have ever known. Everything else that happened, the apology, the vindication, mattered. But that first hug mattered most. Now, here is where the story becomes about something other than a mistake. Because mistakes happen. Police officers are human beings doing a hard, dangerous, high-pressure job, and sometimes working off a bad description in a tense moment, they get it wrong. I've come to genuinely understand that. What actually mattered, what turned this from just a story about an injustice into a story I tell for a reason, was what the officer did after he found out he was wrong. Because he could have done what a lot of people do when they realize they've made a mistake. He could have gotten defensive. He could have uncuffed me with a gruff, "You're free to go," and stalked off, protecting his own ego, never quite admitting he'd been wrong, leaving me standing there re-humiliated and my kids still confused and frightened. That's what wounded pride does. That's the easy, cowardly path, and I braced for it. That is not what he did. Officer Doyle, that was his name, took the handcuffs off me, and then he did something I did not expect. He looked at me, and his own face had changed completely. The hard suspicion was gone, and in its place was something that looked a lot like genuine shame. And he said, "Sir, I am so sorry." And then, and this is the part that mattered most, the part I will always be grateful for, He got down. He crouched down to the level of my crying children. He looked at my terrified 6-year-old daughter and my pale, shaken 8-year-old son, and he apologized to them. He told them that he had made a mistake. He told them that their dad had done absolutely nothing wrong, that their dad was a good man, that he, the officer, had gotten it wrong, and that he was very, very sorry for scaring them. He told my kids directly that their father was not in trouble, that their father was exactly the good dad they knew him to be, and that the mistake had been entirely his. I want to slow down on that, because it was the single most important thing anyone did for me that day, and it wasn't the release, it was the kneeling. Think about what it means for a grown man in a uniform, a figure of authority, to lower himself physically to the eye level of a crying 6-year-old and a shaken 8-year-old and say, in effect, "I was wrong, your dad did nothing, this was my fault, I'm sorry I scared you." He didn't have to do that. The law required him to take the cuffs off. It did not require him to get on one knee in a parking lot and rebuild a child's shattered sense of safety. Josie stopped crying while he talked to her. I watched it happen. I watched my daughter's terror slowly turn into something calmer as this man who had frightened her gently undid the fear, told her the police were not going to hurt her daddy, told her that her daddy was good, and Cody, my serious boy, listened to every word with an intensity I could see, watching this officer take responsibility, filing it away in whatever place children keep the important things. Officer Doyle spent his own pride, in public, in front of a crowd that had watched him be wrong, to give my children back their father whole. I will be grateful to him for that until the day I die, and I mean that without a trace of irony, even though he was also the man who caused the whole thing. I stood there, my wrists free now, and I watched this man restore to my children the thing his mistake had nearly taken from them, their certainty that their dad was good and safe and respected. He didn't just release me. He repaired the damage, publicly, in front of the same people who'd watched me be cuffed, in front of the kids who most needed to see it. He made sure that the last thing my children saw was not their father in handcuffs, but a police officer telling them their father was a good man, and that he, the officer, had been wrong. Do you understand what that took? It is one of the hardest things in the world for a person in a position of authority to humble themselves like that, to admit, fully and publicly, in front of a crowd and in front of children, that they were wrong. Everything in human nature fights against it. The ego screams to save face, to minimize, to justify. Officer Doyle did the opposite. He owned his mistake completely, took all of it onto himself, and spent his own pride to rebuild my dignity in my children's eyes. And in doing that, he taught my kids, and honestly, taught me, one of the most important lessons a person can learn, that real strength isn't never being wrong. Real strength is what you do when you find out you were. I've thought a lot about Officer Doyle since that day, and I've made a kind of peace with him that surprises some people who hear this story, because it would be easy to hate him. He caused the worst moment of my life. He frightened my children. He humiliated me in public. And for a while, in the raw aftermath, part of me did burn with anger at him. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood that he was a human being doing an impossibly hard, dangerous job, working off bad information in a high-pressure moment, and that he made a mistake of the kind that pressure and adrenaline and imperfect information will always produce in imperfect humans. The mistake itself wasn't the measure of the man. What he did next was. And what he did next was about as good as a human being can do. He owned it completely, humbled himself totally, and spent his own dignity to restore mine, in front of my kids, in front of a crowd, asking nothing to soften the blow to his own pride. I have known people who couldn't apologize for stepping on your foot. This man apologized, on his knees, to a 6-year-old, for one of the worst mistakes an officer can make. That's not weakness. That is a rare and difficult strength, and I've tried to be more like him in my own failures ever since. And there was one more piece which I learned as it all settled. The sergeant, the voice on the radio, came by as well, and it turned out he actually knew a little of who I was, knew my name, knew I was a hard-working single dad from around the area, a known quantity, a decent man raising his kids alone. And part of the reason he'd barked "release him now" with such force was that the moment he'd registered which man his officer had detained, he'd known in his gut it was wrong, because he knew I wasn't the kind of man they were looking for. It wasn't just that the real suspect was caught. It was that someone in authority actually saw me, saw the truth of who I was, a good father, not a threat, and used that knowledge to set things right, fast. Being truly seen like that, after being so badly misjudged, meant more than I can easily explain. Because here's the thing about being misjudged. The wound isn't only the handcuffs. The deeper wound is being turned, in an instant, into something you're not. For those few minutes I had been transformed, against all truth, into a criminal, a danger, a bad man, in the eyes of the officer and the crowd, and, worst of all, potentially in some confused corner of my own children's understanding. To be so completely misread is a special kind of violence to the soul. And so, when the sergeant's voice came through with that force, and when I learned that part of the reason was that he actually knew the truth of me, knew I was a decent man raising his kids alone, it wasn't just relief that I wasn't going to be hauled away. It was the restoration of my actual self. Someone had reached in and corrected the false version of me that had briefly replaced the real one. They gave me back to myself, and gave me back to my children as the man I actually am. After being so violently misdefined, being accurately seen felt like being pulled out of deep water into air. I'll tell you what came after, because people always assume there must have been a lawsuit, a payout, some big settlement, and there's a lesson in the fact that there wasn't. The department followed up with me properly, took it seriously, made sure the mistake was documented and addressed, and more than one person in authority told me plainly that what had happened to me should not have happened, and people did suggest I should lawyer up, chase a big check, make them pay. I understood the impulse. But that was never what I wanted, and chasing it would have made the whole thing about money, when it was never about money. What I'd wanted, the only thing I'd wanted, was my dignity back and my children's fear, undone, and I'd gotten both, right there in the parking lot, the moment that officer knelt down. That was the settlement I actually needed, and no check could have improved on it. I didn't want to be a man who turned the worst moment of his life into a lottery ticket. I wanted to be a man who got his good name back and went home and made his kids dinner. So that's what I did. Some things are worth more than a payout, and being able to look my children in the eye as an honest man who was proven honest is one of them. Now, I want to be honest with you, the way I always try to be, because I think it matters more than a clean, happy ending. I know how lucky I was. I know that this is not how these stories always go. I know that most of the time when an innocent person is wrongly detained, the radio does not crackle at the perfect moment. The real culprit is not conveniently caught, and the officer does not get down on one knee and apologize to your crying kids. Sometimes mistakes don't get corrected. Sometimes people in authority never admit they were wrong. Sometimes the damage just gets done and no one repairs it. I got a version of this story with a good ending, and I don't for a second think that's guaranteed for everyone, and I would never want anyone to take from this that the system always works out. It doesn't always. That's precisely why what Officer Doyle did was so meaningful, because he didn't have to. He could have let his pride win. The correction of the legal mistake wasn't up to him. The radio handled that. But the repairing of my dignity, the getting down to my children's level, the full and humble apology, that was a choice, his choice, and he chose rightly when so many people in his position choose wrongly. The lesson isn't trust that it'll all work out. The lesson is, be the person who owns their mistake. Be the one who humbles themselves to make it right. Because you cannot always control whether you're wrong. We're all wrong sometimes, but you can always, always control what you do the moment you find out. And I want to make that practical because it's not really about police at all. It's about all of us. Every single one of us has our own version of the moment Officer Doyle faced. The moment you realize you snapped at your kid over something that wasn't their fault. The moment you understand you were wrong in the argument but your pride is dug in. The moment you accused someone, judged someone, dismissed someone, and then discovered you had it completely backwards. Those moments come for everyone, constantly, in small ways and large, and in every single one of them you get the same choice Doyle got. Protect your ego and double down, or humble yourself and make it right. Most people, most of the time, protect the ego. It's the easy, natural, cowardly path, and it leaves a trail of small, unrepaired damages behind us all through our lives. The rarer, braver thing is to get down on one knee, metaphorically or literally, and say, "I was wrong. I'm sorry. Let me make it right." It costs you a little pride every time, and it is almost always worth infinitely more than the pride it costs. I learned that from the man who handcuffed me. Strange teacher, real lesson. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go. The drive home from that parking lot was very quiet. Both kids were wrung out, the way you are after a big fright, and I kept glancing at them in the mirror, checking the way you do. I made their favorite dinner that night, the easy one, and let them stay up a little past bedtime, and mostly I just kept them close, needing to feel them near me after those minutes when I couldn't touch them at all. And that night, after they were calmer and we were home and it was quiet, I sat down with Cody and Josie to talk about what had happened, because I knew they were still carrying it. And what struck me, what I'll never forget, was what my 8-year-old son said. I asked him if he was still scared about the police officer, and Cody thought about it, and he said no, because he said sorry, he said he was wrong. And I realized that my son had absorbed exactly the right lesson. Not that the police were scary, not that the world was against us, but that a grown man had made a mistake and had been brave enough to admit it, and that this had made things right. And Josie, my little one, had absorbed something too in her 6-year-old way. She looked up at me during that same talk and said, very seriously, "The policeman said you were a good dad." That was the part that had stuck with her. Not the fear, but the correction. Not the handcuffs, but the man kneeling down to tell her that her daddy was good. In her mind, the story didn't end with her father being cuffed. It ended with an authority figure confirming what she already believed, that her dad was a good man. And I understood, listening to my 2 kids, that Officer Doyle's apology hadn't just released me. It had rewritten the whole memory for them. Left alone, the memory would have been the day the police took Daddy. Because of what he chose to do, the memory became the day a man made a mistake and was brave enough to fix it. Same afternoon. Completely different story. The difference between those 2 memories, the difference between a childhood wound and a childhood lesson, was one man's willingness to humble himself. That is how much it matters, what we do when we're wrong. It can literally rewrite the story a child carries for the rest of their life. My kids didn't come away from that day frightened of authority or bitter at the world. They came away having witnessed up close what it looks like when someone owns their error with humility. And I thought, if my children learn nothing else from their childhood, if they learn only that a person can be wrong and still be good as long as they are brave enough to admit it and make it right, then that is a lesson worth even the worst afternoon of my life. Because they're going to be wrong someday too, all of us are, and now they know exactly what to do when they are. I can't give my kids much. I can't give them wealth or a big house or all the things I sometimes wish I could. But that afternoon, by accident, through the worst thing that ever happened to us, they got given something I could never have taught them with words alone. They got to watch, up close and unforgettable, exactly what integrity looks like when it's hard. They saw a man be wrong. They saw the same man be brave enough to admit it. They saw that admitting it didn't make him weak or small, it made him bigger. That's a lesson most people take decades to learn, if they learn it at all, and my 2 kids got it burned into them at 6 and 8 years old. They saw it. And someday, when it's their turn to be the one who has to say, "I was wrong and I'm sorry," I believe they'll find the courage to say it. Because once, on an ordinary afternoon that went terribly wrong and then remarkably right, they watched a man they'd every reason to resent show them exactly how it's done. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about a time you were judged for something you didn't do, or a time someone in your life was big enough to admit they'd been wrong to you and how much it meant. Those are the stories I read every single one of, and the ones about people owning their mistakes always stay with me. And if you stayed with me all the way to the end of this hard one, then you already understand it was never really about handcuffs, and I'm grateful you walked it with me. If you'd like to be here for the next story, you know where the button is. As for me and my kids, Cody's not so scared of that memory anymore, and Josie still tells people, out of nowhere, that a policeman once said her daddy was a good dad. She's got the whole story down to that one line. And you know what? Out of everything that happened that terrible, remarkable afternoon, I think my 6-year-old kept exactly the right part.